The TV show, which has the tagline of being the most popular show in America, has now drawn to a close, and with its ending being something that's definitely divided opinions, I thought I'd address the change of Yellowstone over the years and look at why it's perceived to have had a downfall, especially with Season 5 Part 2 coming back and ending the show this year. I'll be looking at the departure of Kevin Costner, how the show almost became a playground for Taylor Sheridan, the loss of the identity in the show, and how the ending, despite being poetic, still felt like something was missing. So, without further ado, let's dive into this video and analyze why exactly Yellowstone has fallen from grace. Here is the downfall of Yellowstone explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Kevin Costner leaving. Let's first start by addressing the elephant in the room. Well, it's not really an elephant anymore, but it definitely was at the time, and this is probably the largest reason as to why Yellowstone ended up dipping in quality at such a rapid pace and why the story ended up going in a direction that it was never planned on going in. And this all stemmed from Kevin Costner departing the show partway through Season 5. Kevin Costner, as John Dutton, was the heart and soul of Yellowstone. He was the core piece of the family dynamic, and everything that happened pretty much revolved around him. Even in the most recent season when he was no longer in it, the story was still centered around him. It was focused around his death and how it impacted the rest of the family members from an emotional perspective, but also a financial perspective too. So it really showed that without him, there was nowhere for the story to go other than towards its end. The story throughout the entirety of the show heard many of the characters off doing their own things, and we even saw flashbacks throughout the years, which allowed us to gain a deeper understanding of the characters before the present day, something that was definitely missed in Season 5 Part 2. But what Kevin Costner leaving the show did was it made the characters that we were usually used to seeing, having their actions revolving around him with their stories, go free and wild because we didn't care about them as much as we did John Dutton, and it meant that the stakes didn't feel as high, and the emotional attachment wasn't there as much. Take Beth, for example. She was always a loose cannon, and that was something that many of us loved and also hated about the character. But with John Dutton being gone, we didn't see the loose cannon side of Beth at all in Season 5 Part 2. There was no fear that she was going to let her father down, and she was left with real-world problems that she couldn't fall back on her father with. Whilst it was nice to see a more mature side to Beth, and a side to her which had more maternal instincts, I did miss the Beth that we came to know. I think the same can be said about all of the characters in the show. They were in a constant state of mourning and panic about what was going to happen to the ranch, so there wasn't enough emotional range in the characters, and it was just like everything was in this somber, sad state where they were building towards an ending that never should have been happening at the time that it did. Characters weren't unrecognizable, that's not what I'm saying. They just almost weren't the ones that we came to be used to. John Dutton was an iconic character, and it was a shame to see him being killed off screen and us not getting to say goodbye to him in the way that I feel like we should have done. What's also disappointing about this is the fact that Costner left the show because he wanted to work on his Horizon movie trilogy, which just didn't do as well as he hoped it would. I watched it, and it was definitely a mess. There were some good things in it for sure, but it was more confusing to follow than the final season of Yellowstone. So the passion project that he had, the burning desire to ignite, just wasn't worth the cost that it came at to the show that people actually cared about. Kevin Costner's departure didn't just leave a void in the narrative, but also led to a disconnect among the fans. Yellowstone was synonymous with John Dutton's strong presence, and with his abrupt exit, the audience was left grappling with a version of the show that felt incomplete. His absence meant that other characters had to carry the weight of the story, which wasn't as impactful as the family dynamics centered around him. Taylor Sheridan's playground. Another factor in the perceived downfall of Yellowstone was how the show turned into what felt like a personal playground for Taylor Sheridan. Sheridan's storytelling style was always about grit, realism, and complex characters, but as the seasons progressed, the narrative started to drift. The series that once balanced family drama with political intrigue and Western grit started feeling more like a collection of Sheridan's experimental ideas rather than a cohesive story. For example, side plots involving peripheral characters and their romantic endeavors started taking center stage, drawing attention away from the core story. While Sheridan's ambitious storytelling often works in his other projects, here it felt like the show was losing its original identity. Without John Dutton, the ranch's survival didn't feel as high stakes. The series tried to make the Dutton family's next generation the focal point, but it lacked the gravity that John brought to the story. This identity crisis alienated fans who were invested in the original narrative. Kevin Costner's departure didn't just leave a void in the narrative, but also led to a disconnect among the fans. Yellowstone was synonymous with John Dutton's strong presence, and with his abrupt exit, the audience was left grappling with a version of the show that felt incomplete. His absence meant that other characters had to carry the weight of the story, which wasn't as impactful as the family dynamic centered around him. Taylor Sheridan's Playground. Yellowstone had a distinct identity in its early seasons. It was about protecting the Dutton family legacy and their ranch, exploring themes of loyalty, morality, and power struggles in a rugged, unforgiving setting. As the series progressed, however, the focus shifted. The intense, morally gray conflicts that defined the show were diluted, and instead, we got dragged into stretched subplots and melodrama. The introduction of the generations below in 1883 and 1923 had a positive impact on the Yellowstone universe. It expanded the world, making it feel more fleshed out, while also giving us valuable context about the Dutton family in the present-day Yellowstone series. However, the spin-offs also brought some challenges. The stories in 1883 and 1923 were incredibly well crafted, offering fresh narratives that were at times more compelling than the original Yellowstone. This highlighted the cyclical nature of Yellowstone's story, which sometimes felt repetitive, whereas the spin-offs introduced a level of originality that elevated them in many viewers' eyes. For me, 1883 stands out as my favorite of the three. It's one of the best series I've watched in years, an emotional journey that I find myself revisiting often. While the spin-offs undeniably enrich the Yellowstone universe, they also expose some of the flaws in the original show, particularly in terms of acting and character development. At times, Yellowstone felt like it was recycling the same character arcs without significant evolution, making the contrast with the spin-offs even more apparent. The storylines in the final half of this season felt disjointed and lacked a clear identity. Much of the focus was on the family trying to figure out who killed John Dutton, an answer that was never actually revealed, while also struggling to find loopholes to avoid paying the hefty inheritance tax on the ranch. The season seemed dominated by these financial and mysterious elements, leaving little room for the deeper character-driven drama Yellowstone is known for. Jamie, who had been a central character in earlier seasons, felt relegated to a secondary role despite knowing what happened to his father and being tied to the person responsible. His interactions with the rest of the family, particularly with Beth and Casey, were minimal, making the season feel compartmentalized. This lack of meaningful family dynamics created a sense of disconnection and contributed to the season's identity crisis, with the action largely taking place in isolation from the core family conflicts. The interactions between characters in the final episodes felt strained, almost as if Taylor Sheridan felt compelled to kill off a character every episode to create lasting impact. In the 6 episodes of Part 2, 4 significant deaths occurred: John Dutton, Sarah Colby, and then Jamie. Even Jamie's death, which seemed like it had been building for seasons, felt anticlimactic. Though the bloody confrontation was intense and visually gripping, the emotional weight of the moment didn't land as it should have, partly because Jamie had been so isolated throughout the season. The impact of his death just didn't resonate with the same gravitas it might have if the character had been more present in the story. As for the ending, I didn't mind it. The return of land to the Native Americans, fulfilling a promise that had been in the works for over 150 years, felt like a fitting and full-circle moment for the show. It was a powerful conclusion that tied up some major thematic elements. However, the rushed nature of Rainwater's sudden involvement in the land's return left something to be desired. The build-up didn't quite match the speed at which it was resolved. It wasn't bad, but it could have been handled with more depth and pacing. The resolution of the land issue through a random loophole that Casey discovered, which Beth, despite her sharp business acumen, failed to see, felt unrealistic. It seemed more like a convenient plot device to deliver a happy ending and wrap things up within the limited time frame, rather than a believable or satisfying resolution. Given Beth's history as a savvy strategist, this felt like a missed opportunity to showcase her skills more effectively. Yellowstone became one of the most popular shows in the US, but in just 6 episodes, it somewhat tarnished its legacy. While the ending had a certain poetic quality, the cracks in the show, which were evident behind the scenes, inevitably filtered into the story and impacted the overall experience. Despite this, I'll still look back on Yellowstone fondly. With spin-offs like 1923 Season 2, 1944 Season 1, and The Madison, there's still a lot to look forward to in the Yellowstone universe. In the end, though, it's clear that the show's downfall, as it reached its conclusion, was inevitable given the pacing, plot choices, and behind-the-scenes issues. So, that's the downfall of Yellowstone, explained.